OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about part 4 of belonging again. And we've talked a lot so far about how if you're going to have a society, you require to have givens, constants is a way to put it, but if you have those, you're going to risk the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt describes, and we talked about a few more things, but the question we're going to ask today is, is the risk of Hitler worth Bonhoeffer? And maybe we would like to just go, well, it's not, so let's not even worry about character, let's not even worry about belonging, let's just forego the question entirely. But the problem with doing that is it's not possible for human beings to avoid some sort of societal arrangement at all. I mean, if humans come together, they're going to make a polis, to use Aristotle's term, they're going to make a arrangement where people can work together. And if you're going to do that, well, then you're going to have to figure out how to deal with people who don't think the same, who are different, who are diverse, which is going to get you into the question of how to create enough of a unity between those differences so that people aren't, in a Hobbesian way, killing each other all the time, which means that you're going to have certain societal compromises, certain things that are legal, certain things that aren't legal, and we get right back to the problem of givens. So unless you think it's possible for human beings to exist in some sort of Rousseauian state of nature, and one gets the impression from Rousseau that if there is society, there is going to be restriction, that society is inherently holding human beings back from perfection, kind of in a Garden of Eden sense, although my reading of Rousseau could be incorrect. Unless you think that Rousseauian vision is possible, then we can't forego the dilemma of risking Bonhoeffer for Hitler, unless we get rid of givens entirely. But if we do that, then we're going to have an overwhelming existential anxiety for the average person, of which will probably lead to totalitarianism becoming appealing and likely. And the section also talks about how identity today, because of globalization, also talks a lot about college, how it sort of moved people out of small towns into bigger and bigger areas, how identity is increasingly moving higher and higher up an abstract ladder. People no longer will say, oh, I'm from Berlin. They'll say, oh, I'm from Pennsylvania. And if they go to China, they'll say, I'm from America. And also, since local government and local areas increasingly have less power and less authority, and also we're increasingly having to worry about, say, what the federal government is doing because it's stronger, then that's going to sort of weaken and make increasingly fragile local-based identities, and they become more vapient, more empty. Even if, paradoxically, they're more real. I mean, there's a sense in which I am, in fact, if I'm from Berwyn, Pennsylvania, I'm more a Berwinian, I guess, than a Pennsylvanian, and more of a Pennsylvanian than an American. So there's this interesting irony that as local identities seem to lose their strength or their meaning, in a globalized context, at the same time, those seem to be the most robust and the most real, which is kind of strange. And one of the reasons we seem to have to, as I mentioned, identify ourselves by weaker and weaker and increasingly abstract identities is because we're dealing with people due to college, due to business, that aren't going to really know where Berwyn is. They may know where Pennsylvania is. Let's say I go to a college in California and they ask where you're from, I'll probably say Pennsylvania. Or if I go to China, I'll say I'm from America. Certainly not going to say I'm from Rustburg or Bedford, Virginia, or something like that. And so you get more and more habituated to identifying on a increasingly more abstract and arguably alienating identity. And so that may be partially of what's contributing to society and our social identities feeling less rooted. In addition to that, it's harder, I think, for the givens of, say, America to feel like givens compared to, say, the givens of Bedford, Virginia. The more local, in particular, the community, the more robust and meaningful the identity and the givens that come from it. So as we become more cosmopolitan, is the term the chapter uses, those local identities become weaker. And yet those are what are very concrete, and the more we identify on a more abstract scale, that is less able to ground us. And so, so the section just wants to deal with those problems before setting up section 5. I mean, the thing is, too, I think the identities that are based on globalization, those identities are also kind of held together by a sort of like the countries are too big to fail. If America falls apart, It's like the feeling of solidness that we get from America is kind of a fake solidness, as opposed to the solidness of, say, Bedford, Virginia, because you know the farm, you know the river, you know the people that live there. And it's based on, well, America will always have to be strong, or Europe will always have to be strong because it's so large, it's so big, it's so complex, it's so necessary. And so there's a feeling that that's a solid identity, when in fact it's a more abstract identity. And that's an idea I'll let the section explore. And like I said, it's going to lead us to a reflection on a book called The Long Truce by A.J. Conyers, and the difference between humility and tolerance, and how tolerance is also contributing to abstraction of identity. Because tolerance is an ignoring of difference, as opposed to humility, which is an embracing of difference. Similar to the difference, where people are critical of being colorblind in race theory, because when you're colorblind, you're not identifying racial realities. You're ignoring them. Though I think it should be noted that not everyone who talks about colorblind thinking means that, although one could argue that's the unintentional consequence. The same will go with tolerance. So anyway, I don't think it's possible to forego the Bonhoeffer-Hitler dilemma by just saying, well, we're just not going to have social arrangements. I don't think Rousseau is correct. And if we do that, we're going to have givens. And if we have givens, we're going to have to deal with the problem. And then if we're working on bigger and bigger, more concentrated power sources, say Washington, D.C. or America, to ground our identity, then if we do, in fact, risk Hitler by having these conditions of which could potentially give rise to the banality of evil, then it could be on a larger and more dangerous and fatal scale if that bet doesn't go in our favor and we end up with a Hitler, per se. So it's risky to go on a bigger scale. But then again, I guess you could say, if it, like we're saying, it's too big to fail, well, maybe it would be too bad to be possible to get Hitler on that big of a scale, so then it won't happen, might be the argument, and we'll have to explore that. So anyway, that's section 4 of Belonging Again, and we appreciate your time, and you can find all the sections on ogrose.com.